So I want to talk about this idea of independence in the context of free speech. And the moment for this conversation happened on January 21st, 2010, exactly a year and a day after this man was sworn in as President of the United States, when the Supreme Court issued its opinion in the case of Citzens United versus the Federal Election Commission. As you all know, that case excited an extraordinary range of outrage. Lawrence Tribe, perhaps America's leading constitutional scholar, said it marked a major upheaval in First Amendment law. Jonathan Alter said it's the most serious threat to American democracy in a generation. And not to be outdone in hyperbole, this is what Olbermann had to say.
This is a Supreme Court-sanctioned murder of what little actual democracy is left in this democracy. It is government of the people, by the corporations, for the corporations. It is the Dark Ages. It is our Dred Scott.
Now, you might think, Dred Scott? It's a bad decision, no doubt, but it's a little hard to see it as Dred Scott. But even the president was quite emphatic about the mistake in this decision.
With all due deference to separation of powers, last week the Supreme Court reversed a century of law that I believe will open the floodgates for special interests, including foreign corporations, to spend without limit in our elections.
And some corporations are excited about this.
It's a long day. Till now, corporations influence politics with high-paid lobbyists and backroom deals. Have left with as much as corporate interest gained to politicians who could never pass the capability But today, thanks to an enlightened Supreme Court, corporations now have all the rights the founding fathers made for us. It's our democracy. We bought it. We paid for it. That's why Murray Hill Incorporated is taking democracy's next step, running for Congress. Wait and see it.
So Murray Hill is the first corporation to now run for Congress, and they are petitioning to be included on the ballot. Now this opinion, of course, also excited public response. The Washington Post reported among Democrats overwhelmingly opposition to the Supreme Court's decision, 85% opposing it, barely 17% supporting it. Among independents, it was just slightly lower, 81% supporting it. Even among Republicans, 76% of Republicans identified the opinion and identified that they opposed it. So what does the decision mean? What does it actually say about our democracy? How will it affect our democracy? Well, let's start with this concept of democracy. Of course, if you take the Constitution and apply your favorite search tool on it and search for the word democracy, you would discover that the word doesn't appear in our Constitution. Our framers were obsessed with establishing a republic, but by republic, they meant representative democracy. So in our terms, we focus more on the democracy part than the representative part, as they would too if they met our representatives. And I suggest that we think about democracy in this sense as the appeal to a certain kind of dependency. It's the appeal to a government that is dependent in a certain way. Now, historians of the 18th century might think it odd to think that the framers would have been seeking dependency of any sort. Our framers and Jane Austen hated the idea of dependency. This is Jefferson. Dependency begets subservience, and venality suffocates the germ of virtue and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. The Federalist Papers repeatedly attack dependence in describing the problems that beset our nation before the Constitution, save one instance of dependence. Dependence upon the people. And what democracy was intended to be was a dependence upon the people, an institution established with this dependence and no others. But you might say dependence on the people as opposed to what? And the framers were obsessed with identifying the bad dependencies that they feared would infect our democracy. Dependency on foreign princes. The Constitution, Article 1, Section 9, Clause 8, explicitly bans the receipt of any emolument, office, or title of any kind whatever from any king, prince, or foreign state without Congress's approval. This was not so much because they thought a trinket from a French king would corrupt anybody, but because they believed no one in our government should even appear to be loyal to someone outside of our own government. But also, there was a concern about the way different departments might become improperly dependent upon other departments. So the fear was courts would become dependent upon the executive, and the solution was life tenure for judges, so they would not fear retaliation from the executive. They feared the executive would become dependent upon the legislature, so they gave the executive a veto power to assert independence relative to the legislature. They feared legislators would become dependent upon the executive, so they had an emoluments clause that banned anyone from going from Congress to an executive office, at least an executive office created or the terms of pay increased during the time when that member was elected to be a member of Congress. In all of these cases, independence was created by creating a proper dependence and ending what were viewed as improper dependencies. And a proper dependence for an institution like Congress was a dependence upon the people. So, is our Congress dependent upon the people? Well, formally, of course, they are. Congress every 2 years comes up for elections. After the 17th Amendment, the Senate every 6 years comes up for elections. Voting controls these members, technically getting more votes than the other guy, at least if you're running for Congress as opposed to the president, is a necessary condition for returning to office. And even substantively, a strong constitutional requirement guarantees that votes must be equal. The effect of votes must be equal. The one person, one vote principle, born in the 1960s, has as its aim the objective of making sure that your vote is worth as much as mine. And the constitutional obligation on states is to architect districts to guarantee one person, one vote. Now, of course, that obligation creates the opportunity for all sorts of games playing. So here is a district of the United States Congress, and here is another district of the United States Congress. This is my favorite example. This is in Chicago. This is one district, these two green things. I thought districts had to be connected, but in fact these two districts are connected. Route 294 is also part of the district. So if you're going to go door to door in Stone Park, you just walk down Route 294 and then head over to Cicero. That's the way this district works. Now the purpose and effect of this gerrymandering practice that has been encouraged and required by the one person, one vote mandate is to effect safe seats, to produce safe seats. And indeed, the one thing our Congress has been successful at is assuring the re-election of members who want to return to Congress. Now, almost a perfect record of members who choose to run and get returned to Congress, because a significant number of seats in our Congress are safe seats. And the safe seats here mean the minority, and I don't mean racial minority, I also mean political minority, in those seats is often invisible. Nonetheless, the technical requirement of equal voting produces, in principle, a Congress dependent upon the people. But the point we can't lose focus on, even though we recognize and some are repulsed by the idea of safe seats, is that the fact we have safe seats does not mean there's a safe Congress. Meaning, even though some seats are less competitive, even though it's practically impossible as a Democrat to lose your seat in California, where I came from, and we used to say impossible as a Democrat to lose your Senate seat in the state of Massachusetts, where I come from now, Congress, it turns out, is more competitive than it was even 25 years ago. In 1994, for the first time, the Republicans recognized that they had the capacity to oust the Democrats in leadership in the United States Congress. And since that time, there has been an extraordinary competition between these two parties over those relatively few seats where there is some contest to wrest control from the other party. A competition which manifests itself in the effort to raise campaign funds. And the extraordinary rise in the cost of campaigns leads members to spend an astonishing amount of their time raising funds to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. Some estimates range upwards to 30 to 70% of members' time spent raising money to get back to Congress. Now, the question this fact presents is whether this practice is a new dependency. Whether this practice of raising money to get back to Congress creates exactly the kind of dependency that the framers desired not compete with the primary dependency of the people that Congress should respect. Whether this structure of the fundraising Congress produces a marionette Congress, a Congress which is focused not on what the constituents want, but what on the funders demand. Well, my view is that the answer to the question whether this has produced a dependency that the framers would have been repulsed by is it has. Indeed, this fantastic book by Robert Kaiser, So Damn Much Money, completely convincingly, in my view, establishes the rise of this dependency, facilitated through the radical change in the institution we call lobbying, a change that has been effected over the last 25 years. As Kaiser emphasizes, this lobbying industry has produced a certain kind of economy. The economy has three components. There are lobbyists who influence members, members which influence legislation to benefit interests, and interests that, of course, influence the lobbyists. Each of these three pays the other. Each is increasingly dependent upon the other. So the lobbyists pay members. Both during and after the tenure of a member of Congress, they pay members. During the tenure, lobbyists pay members with cash. And I don't mean the brown paper bag cash, I mean the support for campaigns necessary because the cost of campaigns is so high. And when members are living in this structure of dependence produced by the reality of the extraordinary amount of time they must spend raising money, lobbyists become suppliers, or to push the metaphor just a bit, pushers inside of this economy of influence. Now this, Kaiser says, is new. As he puts it, money has been part of American politics forever, on occasion in the Gilded Age or the Harding administration, for example, much more blatantly than recently. But the scale of it has just gotten way out of hand. The money may have come in brown paper bags in earlier eras, but the politicians needed and took much less of it than they take through more formal channels today. So compare, for example, this man, Senator Max Baucus, a man who represents 0.3% of the American population, but arguably the most powerful senator controlling health care legislation. While he was the most powerful senator controlling health care legislation, he brazenly opened his campaign coffers to contributions from the very people he would be regulating, accepting more than $4 million in contributions from the campaign health care industry. Compare Baucus with this man, Senator John Stennis from Mississippi. Stennis was no choir boy, but when he was head of the Armed Services Committee in the early 1980s, he was asked by a colleague to hold a fundraiser for defense contractors who needed to appear before Stennis as in his role as chairman of that committee. Stennis's response was, "Would that be proper? I hold life and death over these companies. I don't think it would be proper for me to take money from them." Now, the point Kaiser makes is that this ethic, which even this man Stennis would embody and practice in the early 1980s, is completely invisible in Congress today. Indeed, laughable to imagine a chairman of any major committee withholding his authority over the people he regulates for the purpose of raising money. So in this sense, during the time members are members, they get paid by lobbyists, and then after they are members, they get paid by lobbyists. Lobbyists pay with their future. As my friend Jim Cooper, congressman from Tennessee, puts it, Capitol Hill has become a kind of farm league for K Street. Members and staffers and bureaucrats have an increasingly common business model, a business model focused on their life after government, life as lobbyists. So Public Citizen estimates between 1998 and 2004, 50% of senators left the Senate to become lobbyists, 42% of members of the House. And in that environment, it's clear how everyone depends upon this particular system surviving. In this sense, after their membership, they are paid by lobbyists. And then members pay the interests through policy that gets changed, sometimes profitably. So the University of Kansas calculated that lobbyist return from efforts with respect to the American Jobs Creation Act had a return on investment of 22,000%. The investment was worth that much to the lobbyists and their industries. And this paper that just was released in the American Journal of Political Science estimates that large companies that spend $1, for every $1 spent lobbying, they lower their taxes by between $6 and $20. Again, an extraordinary return on investment. And then sometimes quite brazenly. So, for example, the New York Times at the beginning of February had this story about Chuck Schumer returning to Wall Street for the purpose of raising money for the Democrats and for his own campaign. But he got a chilly reception from Wall Street, as the Times put it. City's titans of finance at a recent closed-door meeting accused him, Schumer, of being insufficiently pro-Wall Street. One indignant fellow stood up and demanded his donation back. Now, remember, this is Charles Schumer. There is arguably no member of the United States Senate more responsible for turning over regulation to whatever Wall Street wanted, yet even this person is not sufficiently pro-Wall Street. In this sense, the members pay the interest, and then the interest pay the lobbyists. As Kaiser puts it, in earlier generations, enterprising young men came to Washington looking for power and political adventure, often with ambitions to save or reform the country or the world. But in the last fourth of the 20th century, such aspirations were supplanted by another familiar American yearning to get rich. So the emphasis here of this industry, which is about the size of the American recording industry, has produced an enormous amount of new wealth in Washington, D.C. This man, Gerald Cassidy, who is responsible for the architecture of earmarks that now sweeps K Street in revenues, has earned more than $100 million from his work as lobbyist. And as the lobbyists have become so wealthy, Washington, too, has become wealthy. Increasingly, the richest area in the country are the 7 counties surrounding Washington, D.C. itself, because it turns out selling policy is an enormously profitable business. So this is an economy. It hangs together, and it increasingly feeds this marionette Congress. Now, politicians deny this. I was told by a member of Congress that it's ridiculous to suggest that the money affects results. Maybe it affects access. So as former Congressman Mazzoli puts it, people who contribute get the ear of the member and the ear of the staff. They have access, and access is it. Access is power, but it doesn't change results, I have been told. Now, I personally find this pretty hard to believe, at least if you want to be charitable in interpreting what Congress does. Because there's a whole host of easy cases, the kind of 2 + 2 = 4 cases, which government just gets wrong. So as indicated in the introduction, I spent many years of my life working in the area of copyright reform. That work began on October 27, 1998, when President Bill Clinton signed into law a statute honoring this great American, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act. Now, the Sonny Bono Copyright Term Extension Act extended the term of existing copyrights by 20 years. And the question Congress was to ask was whether this extension of existing copyrights advanced the public good. Now, what we know about copyright is that it is an incentive given to create something. And the thing we know about creating something is that that is a prospective action. No matter what the United States Congress does, George Gershwin is not going to produce anything more. So there could be no way extending an existing copyright would fulfill the purpose of copyright to create incentives to produce new work. Indeed, so clear was this point that when we challenged the statute in the Supreme Court, this left-wing economist, this is Milton Friedman, right-wing, Nobel Prize-winning economist, agreed to sign the brief arguing there could be no public policy gain from this statute only if the word no-brainer was in the brief somewhere. So clear was it that this could not extend public good more than it was being overwhelmed by private gain. But apparently there were no brains in this place when Congress passed that statute, overwhelmingly 2 members voting against it, an easy public policy question which Congress just got wrong. Or think about the context of nutrition. There's a consensus among people who know something about the matter. We eat too much of this stuff, not enough of this stuff. 2003, the World Health Organization decided they wanted to advance public policy on the basis of this consensus. So they established a standard saying no more than 10% of your daily caloric intake should come from added sugar. Well, the sugar industry, they have this sweet little logo here, went ballistic. There they are, ballistic. They got the Senate to threaten to withdraw funding from the WHO if the WHO didn't back down from their absurd standard. They wanted the WHO to adopt a standard that 25% of your daily caloric intake could come from added sugar. Well, the WHO didn't back down, but our government did. In 2003, the Food and Nutrition Board promulgated standards saying 25% of your daily caloric intake could come from added sugar. So a balanced diet, according to our government, looks something like this: Fruit Loops or M&Ms for breakfast, a glass of milk, a cheeseburger for lunch, pizza for dinner, indeed 3 slices of pepperoni pizza, and of course sugar cookies for dessert. That is a balanced diet according to our government. Again, an easy public policy question which our government just gets wrong. Or think about the scandal around financial services, which is just beginning to be described in detail so people outside of Wall Street can understand it, and I recommend strongly this book by Simon Johnson and James Quack, 13 Bankers. The story they tell goes something like this: there was a depression, it was really bad. The response from the Roosevelt administration was to establish government regulation in the context of financial services. That regulation had a simple principle: oversight. Oversight in the context of important financial instruments that could affect the national economy. Indeed, every major instrument, from bonds to stocks to savings, were in this sense supervised through these regulations, or you might say regulated by these regulations, regulations that required that they be public, transparent, and that anti-fraud requirements be imposed to guarantee that people tempted by all the money in the world don't break the law. The 1990s came along, and we had a wild new innovation. The innovation was deregulation. The idea that this heavy-handed regulation from the New Deal was hampering financial prosperity. And so there was a steady stream of new financial instruments that were privately regulated, meaning principles of public, transparent, anti-fraud requirements were reversed. There was no public requirement of revealing what you were holding, no transparency requirements, and indeed in some contexts, supported by Alan Greenspan, no anti-fraud requirements for trades affecting these instruments. Now, it's hard to get a sense of exactly the difference that this shift in regime produced, but as Frank Portnoy recently characterized it to me, this is a simple way to understand it. Before the 1990s, 90% of the financial instruments in our economy were subject to this oversight regulation. 10% was outside of this regulatory regime. But by 2007, 90% of the financial instruments in our economy were outside the regulatory regime, and only 10% of the obligations were inside the regulatory regime, creating the obvious incentive to produce the bubble, which of course we all saw burst. But that wasn't enough for Wall Street. Deregulation wasn't enough. They also wanted a certain kind of re-regulation. They wanted a government guarantee that when this bubble burst, there would be a bailout by the government. And as Simon and Quack demonstrate, Simon Johnson and James Quack demonstrate in their book, explicitly asked for and they got these guarantees, producing what Krugman has characterized again and again, socialized risk but privatized benefit. We, the taxpayers, suffered the risk. They, the traders and financial services company, got all of the benefits. Now, from a regulatory perspective, this is insanely stupid. Why, then, did we embrace it? Well, it's hard to know what was in the head of the regulators as they deregulated this field, but one thing we do have pretty clear evidence about is the extraordinary rise in campaign contributions from these industries becoming the most important contributors to campaigns in Washington right now. Or think finally about this context of global warming. There is a consensus. It was questioned a little bit when there was a snowstorm in Washington this year, but I'm assuming that the weather today will revive the sense of the consensus, that we're doing it. As Gore puts it, the debate's over. There are 5 points in the consensus. Number 1, global warming is real. Number 2, we human beings are mainly responsible. Number 3, the consequences are very bad. Number 4, we need to fix it quickly. And number 5, it's not too late. Now, someone wanted to test how robust this consensus was. So they took 1,000 articles from peer-reviewed journals between the period 1993 and 2003 and found that 0% of those articles, exactly 0, questioned that basic consensus. And then there was a comparable study done of popular media articles between 1988 and 2002, finding that 53% of those articles questioned the basic consensus. And of course, what accounts for this difference between the peer-reviewed journals and the popular media journals is the extraordinary amount of money spent on junk science to spread doubt about this phenomenon, giving Congress the backdrop it needs to delay doing anything about this, arguably the most important public policy question facing the globe for at least 10 years, an easy public policy question which Congress gets wrong. In all of these cases, Congress gets these things wrong either because they're idiots or because they are guided by something other than reason. And my own view, I know this is controversial, is that Congress is not a bunch of idiots. It is not stupidity that drives them to these results. It is a dependency that doesn't allow them to do what is obvious to anybody who thinks about the public policy consequences at stake. And of course, it's not just easy cases where this influence has its effect. It is everywhere that policy gets bent to those who pay, and the consequence is bad policy and public trust weakened. So Congress, depending on the polling, is consistently an institution where people believe money buys results. Indeed, today a North Carolina poll demonstrated 80% of voters in North Carolina believe lawmakers listen to the money rather than to good public policy sense. And that produces a world where 22% of the American public has confidence in Congress, the lowest level of confidence that institution has ever had. Indeed, arguably there were more people who had faith in the British Crown at the time of the Revolution than have faith in our Congress today. And that level of mistrust produces enormous cynicism, and that cynicism produces disengagement from the political process for two distinct reasons. Number one, this process produces a distortion in what Congress seems to care about, and people see that distortion. So, for example, if you look at the total contributions made to Congress to run campaigns in 2008, that was about $1.4 billion. Of that $1.4 billion, less than 10% came in contributions of $200 or less. If you looked at the total amount spent on lobbying last year, that number is $3.47 billion. Of that $3.47 billion, less than 1.2% was lobbying on behalf of organized labor. Now, these two numbers signal that policymakers will have an attention that is distorted because of the distortion of the inputs into this equation. As former Representative Byrne put it, she said when she got to Congress, one of her colleagues advised her, always lean to the green, and he wasn't making a point about environmental policy. And this then produces the belief money buys results. Now, number two, the extremism of this system produces this disengagement. There's a perception that Americans are polarized, that we have an extreme right, an extreme left, and not many in the middle. In fact, this is false. The politically active Americans, politicians, people who run campaigns, get active in campaigns, people who vigorously watch MSNBC or watch the news stories or quote news on Fox, they are polarized. But the vast majority of Americans are actually quite moderate, quite in the middle of the range of political views. And that means that the vast majority of Americans become alienated by the way politics actually is played, because the politics is played paying attention to the small percentage who actually engage in politics and ignoring the vast majority who will not turn out to vote or not participate in campaigning. So most Americans thus stay at home and don't engage in this process. And the point is that fundraising in this context makes this worse. Because the lessons fundraisers teach is that you fundraise successfully if you fundraise at the extremes. So if you want to raise money on the right, raise money by being extreme on the right. If you want to make money, raise money on the left, raise money by being extreme on the left. And that further exacerbates this polarization by pushing the two sides further apart. These two reasons lead most Americans to disengage from the political process, leaving, of course, the fox guarding the henhouse. Now, the question that some people ask when this claim about the effect of money is made is, didn't political science teach us that, in fact, money doesn't really affect results that much? There's a wonderful paper by political scientists, most prominently in his work is James Snyder, but others who have been working on this question, as they put it, why is there so little money in US politics? So this question gets framed because of puzzles like this. Take again the sugar industry. There's 6 major producers of sugar in the United States. They have succeeded in getting tariffs that protect them against foreign competition. Their tariffs earn them about $1 billion in extra profits every year. So that's an extraordinary return they get from this government policy restricting free trade. So what are their political contributions to get this $1 billion in return? About $3 million in election cycle. And that leads political scientists to be puzzled. You give $3 to $3.5 million in campaign contributions and you get $1 billion in benefits? You'd think at least the congressman would hold out a little bit and demand a little bit more before they turn over so much money. But in fact, this puzzle has just recently been unraveled by one of the most extraordinary papers in this field I've read, called the iceberg theory of campaign contributions. And what the iceberg theory proposes is that the value of a contribution of, say, $14,000 to a candidate is the same if I give the candidate $14,000 or if I give the candidate $4,000 and threaten to give his opponent $10,000. So I don't actually have to give the $14,000. It turns out, and the paper rigorously tests this against the data and also proves it in mathematical proof, that this dynamic of incentives is sufficient if I can just credibly threaten that I will give the other side the money that will make it harder for the side you're trying to influence to win the election. And they show that given the amounts that candidates can receive, given the limits that PACs could make, there's sufficient influence to explain much of the behavior of Congress and to explain this missing money. So in the sense of the iceberg, all we see is the stuff at the top, the stuff that's actually given, but the part that's threatened and not given is, in this argument, largely responsible for the marionette effect in the way Congress behaves. Even though the contributions are small relatively, this iceberg theory helps us understand how the contributions tied with credible threats can produce exactly the dependency which we would most fear. Okay, so here's a summary, where we are so far. I asked the question, is our Congress dependent upon the people? And I said, I don't believe we can credibly say that our Congress is exclusively dependent upon the people. Instead, we have to recognize the increased role of the funders in this institution, funders which increasingly change the dynamic of dependency. And if we count the threat values that these funders can deliver, it is even worse than it is if you just account for the money. And what's the consequence of this increasing dependency? Well, my view is it's bad for the left and bad for the right. It's bad for the left in all the obvious reasons that we notice right now. We just had a president elected on a change agenda, an agenda of reforms. We've seen that agenda stalled. Indeed, at a frantic moment in the middle of the campaign, sent me this angry email after I criticized them about something, saying, we're running on a platform of universal health care, ending the Iraq war, massive cap-and-trade system, $18 billion in new money for education, a revamping of the tax code to make it more progressive, a restoration of our civil liberties and enforcement of our anti-discrimination laws, a doubling of foreign aid, a huge expansion of national service tied to make a college more affordable, tightening regulation in the financial markets, an unprecedented set of ethics, and the reason I knew this was authentic, that they misspelled transparency rules governing the White House. Now that long list of reforms has been stalled, and it has been stalled because of the way money plays into this system. Now, some people say, wait a minute, what about healthcare reform? Doesn't healthcare reform demonstrate that Barack has changed Washington? And indeed, in this breathless article by a writer who I admire deeply, Ezra Klein. He writes of the twilight of the interest groups. As he puts it, the Obama administration succeeded at neutralizing every single industry. I was astonished when I heard this, because of course I wish that were true, but my view is closer to Glenn Greenwald's view. Glenn wrote a response to Ezra. He said, if by neutralizing, Ezra means bribing and accommodating them to such an extreme degree that they ended up affirmatively supporting a bill that lavishes them with massive benefits, then he is absolutely right. But being able to force the government to bribe and accommodate you is not a reflection of your powerlessness, quite the opposite. And to pretend that this bill represents the twilight of the interest groups, that special interests have been, quote, neutralized, is just hagiography and propaganda. The way this bill has been shaped is the ultimate expression and bolstering of how Washington has long worked. One can find reasonable excuses for why it had to be done that way, but one cannot reasonably deny that it was. In the words of my favorite philosopher, David Byrne, it is the same as it ever was. In all of these cases, the status quo succeeds in stopping the reform, again, because of the dependency that the status quo has established. That is bad for the left. But often missed in this story is that this same structure is bad for the right. So if the right's hero is Ronald Reagan articulated a certain fear about how democracy would develop. His fear was that government would spin out of control, and the cause of that spinning was both internal and external. Internal, because of bureaucrats who would ever more aggressively try to take control of a wider swath of the American economy and civil liberties. And the external threat was the threat from democracy itself. As Reagan put it, quoting, he said, a man named Alexander Tytler, though it's not clear that there was such a character, at least a character who wrote something like this, Reagan said, a democracy cannot exist as a permanent form of government. It can only exist until the voters discover that they can vote themselves largesse out of the public treasury. From that moment on, the majority always votes for the candidate promising the most benefits from the treasury, with the result that democracy always collapses over loose fiscal policy. So the villains in Reagan's story are the bureaucrats and the mobs, and the consequence of their villainous behavior is an unchecked government growth and eventual bankruptcy of our government. Now, one could say, plausibly, that he was right, in the sense of correct, about what happened over the last 30 years. Enormous growth in government, US federal spending shooting through the roof, the cost of total spending relative to median house income growing much, much faster than median household income. And you could say he was right about the bankruptcy, as we see the extraordinary increase in the national debt. That is an increase funded, as the Heritage Institute has put it, by both Democrats and Republicans, and we're now facing deficits that are higher than they have ever been in US history. So if growth of government spending and bankruptcy were the predictions, Reagan was right about those predictions. But was he right that this was caused by the bureaucrats and the mobs? Ronald Reagan didn't have the benefit of observing the way Washington works today. And so when we ask whether these are the cause, we should consider the way Washington works today. So, for example, this is the Communications Act, governing telecommunications and other communication services in the United States. It now has 6 titles. Title II of the Communications Act deals with what we traditionally think as telephone service, telecom. And Title VI deals with cable television. When Al Gore was vice president, he had the idea of merging the internet components of Title II and Title VI into a new Title VII that would govern all the internet-related infrastructure, and he would deeply deregulate that infrastructure so that there was basic rules about interconnection, but nothing else that would hamper investment through government regulation. His chief of policy took this to the Hill, and as described to me, this was the response they got from the Hill. Hell no. How are we going to raise money from the telecoms if we deregulate them? So the idea is the scope of regulation is in part driven by the need to raise money from the target of the regulation. And the resistance against shrinking the size of government is not bureaucrats who have some appetite for regulating more and more. It's members of Congress who want to make sure that they continue to have the leverage they need when it comes time to raise money, to pull the chains, to get the money into these campaigns. Or think about this practice of tax extenders. These things called targeted tax benefits, which are these tax provisions written in what seem like general ways, but when you work out what's said, points to one particular company. So it says things like, for all corporations incorporated on June 1st, 1944, in the town of Williamsport, Pennsylvania, with a board of directors comprised of 3 members that happen to come from the city of Philadelphia, blah, 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 you get the following tax benefit. Now, of course, that's very valuable for the companies that petition for it, but the Congress operates in general under a pay-go principle, meaning for every benefit you give, you have to show how you're going to offset it through additional tax revenues. So these extenders every year require reauthorization. These benefits every year have to come up for another vote. And that process of reauthorization has created its own political economy. So as Rebecca Kaisar describes in this piece, the consequence has been an explosion of these targeted tax benefits. As she puts it, it would not have cost more than $22 billion for the period 1996 to 2001 to make permanent all of these targeted benefits. But after the 2003 Act, it would cost more than $430 billion in the 10th year to repeal the sunset provisions, meaning make them permanent. So this is a more than 20 times increase in the size of this game. Now, why has this increased so dramatically, and why has this stopped so rudely? There we go. Oh, stop. So why has this changed so dramatically? Well, the answer is a certain dynamic, a political dynamic. As these are about to expire, there is a huge campaign funding opportunity for the campaign funders, meaning members of Congress. As she puts it, legislators act in their own self-interest by extracting rents and pleasing certain constituents without concern for the social welfare cost of doing so. So why doesn't Congress just eliminate this silly game? We can imagine a congressman responding as the congressman responded when Al Gore suggested they deregulate telecom. Hell no, how are we going to raise money from these targets if we eliminate their targeted tax benefit? Or finally, again, think back to the Sonny Bono Act, an act which extended an existing monopoly only to benefit the monopoly holders. Why doesn't Congress just give up this practice? Again, you can imagine congressmen saying, how are we going to raise money from the copyright holders if we stop extending their copyrights? The point is, in all of these 3 cases, it's the same dynamic, a political economy that government goes through that is guided increasingly by one question. How does this form of regulation help us raise funds? Which means that we get more regulation, more complicated taxes, and senseless monopolies because of this dynamic. And it is therefore no surprise that though we have had 20 years of conservative presidents since Reagan was inaugurated out of 29, we have no smaller government and no simpler taxes. This system, in this sense, is bad for the right. It's bad for both. The status quo government we have produced because of this dependency on status quo funders blocks the opportunity for both sides to achieve what they say their principles seek. It's against that background now I want to take you back to Citzens United. For it's against that background that we have to think about how the court resolved this question of whether the First Amendment protected corporations in their desire to spend corporate funds in political campaigns. The court resolved this question on the basis of a free speech claim. The statute said that in 60 days before an election, corporations were not allowed to expend campaign expenditures from corporate funds. Of course, before the 60 days, they were free to. During the 60 days, they could use their PAC to. And during 60 days, the executives could be paid whatever they want, and the executives could spend their money on these campaign expenditures, but the corporation could not. The question the court had to address was, as they put it, could the government, quote, censor this corporate speech? And they saw it as censorship because the views by these entities, corporations, were either banned or burdened, depending on how you view the regulation. And it's censorship then because the views of others, mainly non-corporations, were not banned or burdened in a similar way. And so framed, there was an obvious answer. No, this was not permissible under the First Amendment jurisprudence. The government was, in the court's perspective, taking sides, and if anything is verboten in the context of First Amendment jurisprudence, it is that the government can't take sides in such a political debate. Now, some people, Justice Stevens most strongly, argued, but what about the special advantages that corporations get by virtue of being a corporation? Why can't you condition their ability to get those benefits on their giving up the freedom to speak as a corporation? Whether or not they are persons, why couldn't this be the condition? But as the court said, quoting Justice Scalia, it is rudimentary that the state cannot exact as the price of those special advantages the forfeiture of First Amendment rights. Now, if you think about this a little bit, this is a reference that's increasingly obscure, I apologize, but there is a kind of Blade Runner moment here. As we see this entity that we've created as endowed by their creator, us, with certain unalienable rights, namely this right to free speech. By some magic, they have received these rights, and the court is saying that the government can't take those rights away as a condition for these special benefits. And so the government can't regulate this kind of speech. Now, there's an endless list of quibbles one could have with this opinion. But I don't want to burden tonight with those quibbles. I want to agree with the fundamental principle behind Citzens United, that we should seek a system that protects this speech, the speech of persons, of corporations, indeed of dolphins. It doesn't matter who the speaker is. It's irrelevant who the speaker is. The only relevant question we should be asking is, why is the government purporting to regulate the speech? And if it's because the government doesn't like the perspective of the speaker, then of course that should be unconstitutional regulation. But the purpose of me setting up this question against the background of this long story about the evolving dependency that has taken over our form of democracy is to frame the obvious issue the court never asked. Is that what the limits on campaign expenditures are? Efforts to silence one side in a debate. For think about a possible amendment in light of Citzens United to the Constitution, an amendment that says, nothing in this Constitution shall be construed to restrict the power to limit, though not to ban, campaign expenditures of non-citizens of the United States during the last 60 days before an election. Many people wonder whether corporations are persons. Maybe they are, but the one thing nobody wonders is whether a corporation is a citizen. Of course, a corporation is not a United States citizen. So just like this would say we could ban the Chinese from or limit the Chinese campaign expenditures during 60 days before an election, this amendment would say we could limit corporations, also non-citizens, during the last 60 days before the election. So is there a reason to limit but not to ban their speech? And of course, the obvious answer in light of everything I've said so far is, of course there is a reason. It is to avoid precisely the dependency we have seen arise in the context of the way campaigns are now funded, to avoid this marionette Congress. Now, the First Amendment maven says, okay, it's a good objective, but do we need to censor to avoid that dependency? And again, we have to answer that question in light of important context. I've already shown you this picture of the skew in private money in politics, the skew favoring the wealthy and the corporate interests relative to labor, for example. But these numbers don't begin to measure the potential effect of unlimited corporate speech in the political market. Indeed, if you take 1% of the profits of the corporate Fortune 400 in 2008, and imagine them, with their newfound freedom, devoting 1% of their profits to political speech, that would be a number of $6.2 billion, more money than the total amount raised and spent by Congress in 2008 and the total amount spent on lobbyists in 2009. It has a potential to swamp the political field, thereby exacerbating precisely the problem that I described with dependency. So, in light of that, of course, all of us should be pushing a solution suggested by a Republican 102 years ago, what I call citizen-funded elections, by which I mean a system where candidates voluntarily opt in to a system of small dollar contributions only, a system modeled but modified a bit on what Connecticut has just recently adopted. So a statute in the bill in the House right now, the Fair Elections Now Act, which has more than 140 co-sponsors, would say that for every $100 you receive in contributions, you can get that matched 4-to-1, so $500 is what that $100 is worth, so long as you commit to receiving only contributions maxed at $100. And an alternative, similar in motivation, is a proposal by Bruce Ackerman and Ian Ayres, a proposal that would say essentially every voter would get a $50 democracy voucher. Conservatives like education vouchers. So here's a democracy voucher that you could give to candidates who agree to limit their total contributions to small dollar contributions, and then you could give $100 above the democracy voucher maxed per citizen. That framing has the nice characteristic of raising exactly $6 billion to respond to the Fortune 400, $50 times 120 million voters. But the point is, either way, under the Larson-Jones bill or under the Ackerman-Ayres proposal, the objective of these changes is to make it so that nobody could reasonably believe that money was buying results in Congress. So that we all could believe, as we all want to believe, that the reason Congress got wrong, whatever they got wrong, was because there were too many Democrats or too many Republicans or too little attention paid to this important issue, but not because of the money. To make it essentially possible, again, to conceive of this institution with trust. But people increasingly push me in this context to ask, is that going to be enough? In light of Citzens United, is that going to be enough? And the answer is, I'm not sure. Increasingly, I doubt it. First Amendment maven says in response, well, what about disclosure here? Doesn't disclosure take care of all the problems you're concerned about in the context of Citzens United? So if a campaign gets an extraordinary infusion of support because Exxon decides to spend $10 million supporting the candidacy because the candidate happens to believe that Al Gore is smoking weed when he talks about global warming, won't the voter recognize that and be able to decide not to support this candidate because he's obviously beholden to these corporate interests? Well, that would be true if there were no iceberg here. Because, of course, disclosure works when we're disclosing money that has actually been given. But when a company sits down with a candidate and says, we don't want to have to spend $5 million in this district to get somebody who has our views about global warming, that threat is not disclosed. So there's no opportunity for the public to even know who said what, and it's that threat that affects the power. So, my view is that of course we should try these citizen-funded elections right now, and we run a site called Fix Congress First that is trying to help mobilize support for this change in legislation, a change that would produce more speech, not less speech. A change focused not on silencing anybody, but a change focused on encouraging a wider range of people to participate in the political market, but a range that would change the kind of fundraising that Congress now engages in. But I also think we need to prepare to do more if citizen-funded elections alone fails, where by more, I mean establishing a system of citizen-funded elections. Meaning giving Congress the power to limit, but not ban, non-citizen campaign expenditures. So that the final days of a campaign, at least, are days dominated by citizen arguing with citizen, and the Chinese and the Chamber of Commerce have been pushed to the side of telling us their ideas for great public policy, but not running campaigns to push candidates to adopt them. Now, this change, of course, is a change that requires an amendment to the Constitution. There's a long list of amendments that have been proposed in the United States Congress. There's no reason to take seriously the thought that the United States Congress is going to amend the Constitution. There's not a chance in, well, I won't say it, but you know where, that there are 67 votes in the United States Senate to amend the Constitution. So we've pushed for a more radical, destabilizing move, taking advantage of the Constitution's second path to amendment, where the framers envisioned the possibility that Congress would be captured and there needed to be an external change that was imposed upon it, and that was by creating the possibility in Article 5 for a convention called by the states for the purpose of proposing amendments to the Constitution. Proposals that still require 3/4 of the states to ratify them for them to have any effect, ratified not by referenda of citizens, but ratified by state legislatures and possibly state conventions. Changes that, because they required 3/4, could be blocked by just 12 states voting no. And so neither side in the political extreme should fear this process because there are 12 solid red states and 12 solid blue states in our political economy. Now, the aim of both of these changes, of course, is to sever this tie and to change this funders' Congress into the People's Congress, again, one dependent upon the people. Now, let me just say one more word in closing. So this is a picture of a poet that you didn't know that you knew, but you know him. His name is Martin Niemöller. He was a German pastor, theologian, born in the late 19th century, and he started around 1946 uttering a completely familiar story. He said, "First they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the socialists, and I did not speak out because I was not a socialist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak out for me. Now, Niemöller is demonstrating a certain kind of insight. An insight we might think of as at the core of intelligence. I discovered red ants have this insight. I stepped on a couple of them, and within a couple minutes, thousands were swarming around my feet. I don't think cows have this insight. I think you can just tip one cow over and none of the rest are going to notice anything that's happening. But I think we can think of this as a test of intelligence. Can you recognize an underlying cause to the problem you're facing and respond? Can you see the pattern here and do something about it? Now, Henry David Thoreau thought it was rare. He wrote, "For every 1,000 hacking at the leaves of evil, there is one striking at the roots." But the question here is it possible? Because as we live in this moment of post-Obama admiration, and we see the long list of reforms promised in this administration, many are recognizing a kind of Niemöllerian insight. We could reframe his poem like this. First, they slowed healthcare reform, and I did not speak out because I had healthcare. Then they stopped global warming legislation, and I did not speak out because global warming isn't really my issue. Then they stopped the regulation of the financial sector, and I did not speak out because maybe it would hurt my 401k. Then they blocked food safety laws, and I did not speak out because I like cheap beef. And then they came for my issue, and there was no one left to speak out for it, or better yet, no lobbyists left to hire to speak out for it. Now, the point is, there is a pattern here, an underlying cause. And the question is whether we're going to respond more like the cow or more like the ants, whether we'll recognize this pattern or remain oblivious to this underlying evil, whether we'll do something to stop it. Now, my view is that something should not involve anything anyone could call censorship. That response instead should be to restore the proper independence, restore the proper dependence that our framers envisioned for this institution of Congress. And we, all of us, have the responsibility to take the steps to do something about this problem. Join us in that, for the strongest response to the Citzens United is, of course, that citizens might unite to reverse the pathology this case will only make more real. Thank you very much.